You are listening to the GodArchy podcast, where we shove a crowbar between state and church. This is the spot where Christian faith intersects with libertarian anarchism and voluntaryism. I'm your host, Mike Meharry. In this episode, we're going to talk about science. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the GodArchy podcast. As always, I do very much appreciate the fact that you've taken a bit of time out of your day to listen to the show. As I said in the intro today, we're going to talk about science. I cannot say that without thinking of the Thomas Dolby song, "She Blinded Me with Science." I'm actually going to put the video in the show notes page because I think that earworm should be in your head just like it is in mine. But the other day I was perusing Facebook and I got sucked into some train of comments, and it was about masks. And somebody posted, "Well, I wear a mask because of common sense and science." And I thought, just saying science doesn't make something true. It's almost like we've turned science into this religion or this dogma that just by invoking the word, whatever it is, that ends all debate. And whatever it is that you're applying the science to, the scientific interpretation has to be true. And that's really a misuse of science in my view. And so I wanted to do an episode and talk a little bit about science, kind of dig into this idea of science, because I think at the core, sometimes we're asking science to do too much. There are things that science can certainly tell us. Science is important, but there are things that science can't tell us either. Science can tell us the hows of things sometimes, but not necessarily the whys. And so I think it's important to put science in its place. And on the flip side of that, I think there are certain circles of Christianity that really denigrate science. And, I think that's just as bad. Science certainly has its place. It reveals a lot about the world we live in. So I wanted to talk about it, like I said, but I don't really have any background in science other than the fact that, I took some science courses when I was in college. But I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. So I started thinking, well, who in the world can I talk to that can really give a good insight into science? And I thought, I know who. Norman Horn, who is the founder and president of the Libertarian Christian Institute. He is very much a scientist. He actually has a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. And a master's in chemical engineering, bachelor's in chemistry. He's won numerous awards for writing and research in engineering. He also has a theology degree on top of that. Dude is like super smart. But I thought this is a great person to talk to about science because he is a scientist. He holds science in high regard. He's also a Christian. And I thought, Norman can probably do a good job of helping us put science into a proper context. And indeed, the conversation turned out every bit as fruitful as I had hoped it would be. So we're just going to go ahead and bring Norman on now and talk about the science. All right, Norman, welcome back to the GodArchy podcast.
Hey, thanks, Mike. It's always good to be here with you.
It's always good to be with you together or something like that.
Yeah.
So this is, I'm not sure where this is going. I'll be honest. We'll let the audience know up front. I'm not sure where this is going, but I've been thinking a lot lately about science. And I thought, who do I know that knows something about science? And I thought, Norman, because you are a chemist. Is that correct? Chemist, right?
Well, I'm a little bit of everything. My professional background is in chemical engineering. But I've also been kind of a chemist as well. Right. Those are technically different fields, although they are very closely related.
Right.
and educationally, I come from, I do have degrees in chemistry, and even what I did as a postdoc at MIT and in my professional life has been in like flow chemistry and a bunch of different stuff.
So it's safe to say, it's very safe to say that you know a whole lot more about science, a scientific method, scientific things than ye old journalist over here.
I think that would be a fair assumption to make. Yes.
Yeah. So here's kind of what I've been thinking, because we've seen a lot of talk about science in mainstream media lately. The whole we've got to trust the science in the realm of the coronavirus, and I think even before that, with the climate change and those types of things.
Sure.
And my sense is that I feel like a lot of people are asking science to do too much. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Okay, good. We're on the same page then. So what I want to start with is kind of a meta question. What can science tell us about the world that we live in? That's real meta.
Yeah, it's real. That is real meta. Not exactly the first question I expected to come out, but I think the answer is a lot, but not everything.
Right.
There's a distinct limitation to what the field of empirical scientific knowledge can ascertain about the world. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, we could say, if perhaps a little more broadly, because even doing science, you kind of have multiple different methods within that. You could say the mathematical sciences, for instance, and say something a little different. Mm-hmm. It's a very different kind of truth statement to say that to define the math behind calculus and integrals and derivatives and things versus here is how the behavior of an atom changes upon differing types of stimuli, right. For instance. That's a very different sort of science in each case.
Right.
So there's a lot of different things that we can get out of just science, broadly speaking, but it doesn't say everything.
Right.
Knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't give you a moral high ground, for instance, against somebody else who is positing that they have the right to do aggression against you or
right.
something to that effect.
Right.
So there's certain moral judgments, for instance, that we can't really approach just using the scientific method. Yeah. And anybody who says otherwise is kind of crazy.
Right.
And there's also problems when you try to apply different methods in realms where they shouldn't be. And this is quite evident in, say, for instance, the Austrian tradition mm-hmm. of economics, where the differentiation between the inductive method that we practice in the physical sciences right. suddenly becomes applied by arguably some rather spurious individuals and people who are interested in malfeasance right. Into operations where really what you need is a deductive method. And that's right. something that, Mises and Hayek and Rothbard and others in the Austrian tradition have severely criticized. And for the listener's sake, we could say, Theory and History by Mises is a good place to look into that. The Ultimate Foundations of Economic Science by Mises, and there's at least the book by Hayek, and I have it on my bookshelf. It's about 20 feet away, and I can't remember the exact name, but I'm sure that we can get it in your show notes or something. There's plenty of work by Hayek and Mises in this regard, as regarding the method of doing science, especially as it pertains to economics,
right.
versus the empirical way of doing things in the natural sciences, for instance.
Right. That makes sense. Just for sake of people that aren't as well versed in such things, can you explain the difference between inductive and deductive?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I guess you could say there's a couple of different things that really set them apart from one mm-hmm. another. For instance, one way we would think about it is simply the difference between, say, doing math, which right. is 2 + 2 = 4, 4 + 4 = 8, and so on, versus what we do in, say, chemistry and chemical engineering, where what we are trying to learn via natural phenomena it has a different sort of uncertainty to it. In order to ascertain the truth of a scenario, we're actually trying to we establish hypotheses, and we test whether that hypothesis should or should not be rejected on the basis of the experiments that we've run that attempt to disprove the hypothesis.
Right.
So it might be, for instance, it might be something like, okay, let me, I guess I'll give an example of like what I do even now, which is I work a lot with the ultraviolet light disinfection technology.
Okay.
And so if I want to understand whether or not, my LEDs in my UV cabinet are operating successfully, I might try to run an outcome test where I put in bacteria and I see what comes out.
Right.
There's an uncertainty associated with that because I have to be able to say with some sort of certainty that what I did had an effect.
Right.
And how do I do that? Well, I set up controls and I set up ways in which I can disprove or eliminate all other possibilities other than that my stimulus actually caused the effect that I set out to work for. So that's a very different sort of method that is inductively getting or backing into the truth rather than going from point A to point B to point C and we get 2 + 2 = 4, 4 + 4 = 8. It's very different in that regard.
Yeah.
And the way this applies in economics in particular is that whenever you have human or purposeful interactions in a scenario such as this, we don't have the luxury of saying that nature is perfectly regular around it.
Exactly.
The fundamental and by the way, this is a very Christian insight from history. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna meander around a bit, but we can do that.
Free. We do that.
In the world of antiquity, they thought the world was chaotic,
right?
And there was no regularity about things. It was the whim of the gods that made things happen,
right?
And Christianity said no. God we'll just call it the Judeo-Christian tradition in this case, said no. God created the world to be an orderly place.
Right.
God created the world with regularity. God created the world to be understood. Mm-hmm. And if we have if it has the capacity to be understood, there must be a method by which we can go and understand it.
Right. That makes sense.
And so on the one hand, we have the ideas of logical deduction. And so we took all the greatest ideas from around around the world at the time, from Arabic numerals and discarding Roman numerals and things like that, and taking the sciences that were or the things that were learned from sort of I almost even call them alchemists in a way. Mm-hmm. The pharmakeia people and so on, people who worked with medicines and herbs and plants and all sorts of substances to try and anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah.
They bring all this together and they say, okay, now what we need to do is develop a method by which we can ascertain if what we believe to be the case about a certain thing is indeed the case. Mm-hmm. And that is essentially how the scientific method got developed, but it comes from a philosophical background that says the world is knowable.
Right.
The world is created in a way that acts in regularity. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but back to where this kind of differs in with respect to deductive versus inductive. In the case of economics, when we start inputting human interactions into it, we no longer have the assumption that can be built into our model that this regular world, if I do A, B is going to happen, cause and effect. Because if the human variable is, well, humans have will. They can make changes and they can push their will out into reality in a way that a tree cannot, a piece of soil cannot, and so on. So that's really important to remember.
Yeah.
And thus, if you try to apply the inductive method in order to understand human behaviors in such a way, there's only a very limited application to where that really works.
Right.
Which is why Mises and Hayek and Rothbard severely criticized the scientism of their era, those folks who would try to leverage science in this kind of weaponized sense and say, well, because we can adjust our statistics and we can, kind of play around with these models. We can find ways of reducing human activity into certain categories or predictabilities, and that's not always the case.
Yeah,
and that's why they're often wrong.
Yeah, I'll give you a good example from the realm of economics that kind of. This is where my mind went as you were talking this. Thinking about something like the minimum wage.
Oh yeah, that's a good one actually for this. Yeah.
So you'll get these, these mathematical charts, and they'll say, "Well, look, we hiked the minimum wage here, and we actually saw an increase in employment."
Yeah.
And the problem with that is there's no way that you can take all of the other factors out of there's no way that you can take an economic principle like that and put it in a laboratory, and take that one thing out. You mentioned the ultraviolet light. You can take a certain wavelength of light, and you can take a certain bacteria, and you can isolate those things. You can't isolate a minimum wage.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's all kinds of other factors that can impact the way human beings behave out in the real economy. So
yeah,
I think that does a really good job of limiting. Kind of showing that limit. Now, let's look at the flip side of that, though. I think I really saw it a lot when I was younger. So, like growing up in the 80s, when...
Hey, I grew up in the 80s. What do you mean?
Well, okay. So it depends on when you say growing. When I say growing up, I'm talking like high school, high school, college for me. My coming of age time.
Sure.
In the political world, evangelical Christianity was a very, very strong force. I think much more so than it is today, although I think it's still there. But I think there was a very strong strain of anti-science that kind of ran through evangelical Christianity, and maybe still does. I don't know. Maybe it's because I don't pay attention to that anymore. But this idea that we talk about, I mentioned science trying to do too much. I think sometimes people try to make the Bible do too much. Does that make sense?
Goodness. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I mean, Genesis isn't a physics textbook, right?
that is true. It's definitely not. And people who want to try and make it into that, it's definitely have a little bit of an issue. My father-in-law loves to say, the Bible doesn't teach you how to bake a cake, and it was his way of saying that the Bible has a purpose.
Right.
The Bible, it tells us all sorts of things about history, but it doesn't tell us everything about history.
Right.
The Bible tells us all sorts of things about life in the universe, but it doesn't tell us everything. Mm-hmm. And to presume that that is the way that God designed it is kind of presumptuous upon us.
Right.
In many respects. It's trying to force God into saying certain things that we say are important, rather than taking him kind of at his word.
Yeah,
in a sense, not to use a bad pun here, but yeah, it's very awkward when you try and do these sorts of things, and that it can get really awkward. Back in the I mean, I was a homeschooler.
Right.
In the 90s. And so that came, with it and bless us all. There were so many great people, and I don't mean by any stretch about what I'm about to say to denigrate my own history and my parents and what we tried to do, or anyone who was in from that era. But we did have some blind spots, I think.
Yeah.
And for goodness, I mean, I think I've learned a lot since then that I think we're always trying to improve. And there were so many great things, but there were some kind of blind spots. Mm-hmm. And even as it pertained to sort of science in general. Now, it wasn't necessarily, and here's I guess an important point here. It wasn't necessarily for a terrible reason.
Right.
And that's what's interesting about it. It's like, you can kind of see how they got there when similarly even what we were just saying, for instance, was that there are those out there who want to weaponize science.
Sure.
And do some bad stuff with it.
I will take it even a step farther and say that there are some people who want to make science into a kind of religion of its own,
Oh.
I mean, with its own doctrines and dogmas and moral certitudes and all of these type of things.
Absolutely. And so like that's on the one side we had that kind of push, and on the pole, the reason why I think sometimes that our, my compatriots of the day, behaved in certain ways with regards to science is that they were seeking to the best that they could to honor God in every way that they possibly could imagine.
Yeah.
And so it all came from good motivations and perhaps some rational, some very prescient ways of observing what was going on in the world around. I mean, the homeschool movement really, even was generated by a very libertarian ideal.
Sure. Right.
The notion that perhaps it is a bad idea for the government to have control of the education of my children. Who knew? and so, that's why it's very interesting to me to kind of to look back on those days, is that I think that there was an instinct or a just a way of thinking that they approximated very quickly in the homeschool movement, more broadly speaking, that what they were looking at was something that they needed to exit.
Yeah.
That being the public school system,
right.
and realizing that there was a danger there.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, that I guess getting back to the science point though, is that, I mean, in a genesis of a movement such as that, you're bound to, have some false starts and missteps here and there. And,
mm-hmm.
One of them was perhaps not focusing very well on the philosophical aspects of what science is and why it works,
right.
and how it works, so that we could communicate that to our kids and encourage a greater participation in it.
Right.
Because you're not gonna go and take over science by just avoiding it.
Right.
And so I think that it was really cool though to graduate at the time that I did and go into an engineering school where I was surrounded by a bunch of really smart people, mm-hmm. and and a lot of very smart Christian young men and women,
right,
who were great influences and really kind of, even if we weren't all on the same page exactly, we were all heading in the same direction.
Yeah, and
that was super, super important to me at the time. So, yeah.
So
anyway.
let me throw this out to you, and I don't know if I'm changing the subject or not. Maybe not. But how do you react when you hear the term settled science?
I don't really like it because I know how loaded it can be.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting topic to kind of consider, because there are things that are more settled than others,
right?
Because it's one thing. Oh man, I could really go on and on about this, but it's one thing to say that the first law of thermodynamics is settled science,
right? It's
another to say something like UV disinfection is settled science,
right?
It's another if you were to try and say, well, modern monetary theory is a settled science.
Right.
And it's so I don't like that how imprecise it ends up becoming, mm-hmm. because it ends up not really saying very much.
Right.
The crux of it, I think, is that to be in science means inherently to have a bout of skepticism about you.
Sure.
To where the reason why we would say something is settled is because the evidence there's a preponderance of evidence toward that conclusion, mm-hmm. and the contrary evidence is not favored.
Right. And
so, again, if we're talking about thermodynamics, for instance, I mean, there's a reason why we call something a law.
Right.
Of, is that there is no observed or even conceivable phenomena that can really contradict it.
Right.
If it did, it would the entirety of everything would fall apart.
Right.
Basically. And that's why we don't have, even as it pertains to things that, some Christians don't like, and evolution, for instance, there's no laws of evolution. There are no evolutionary laws.
Right.
It's a theory, but just because it's a theory doesn't mean that it's just a theory, so we can discard it either.
Right.
So it gets into a lot of terminologies that we use and throw around that become, I think, very problematic. This goes, interestingly enough, and this goes to something I've said many, many a time. And if you, at the Libertarian Christian Institute that I'm the president of and all that, I'm sure you kind of said that in the intro or whatnot.
Yeah, we told them all that.
We told them already? Okay,
yeah.
We told them all
Full disclosure.
Full disclosure. All right, cool. Well, a while back, Doug Stewart and I did a talk about science and in the use and misuse of science and public policy as a podcast, and we can probably throw you a link to that regard.
Definitely do that.
And I said this in there, and that, at least for me, I was trained very distinctly by my mentors to be specific as possible in communicating science, what I really meant.
Right. Being
clear about what it is that I know to be true versus this is what I think based on some, body of evidence, but it may not necessarily be certain yet, versus I think this might work. This is more of a working hypothesis and needs some additional evidence. And, to be that level of certainty needs to be communicated.
Right.
And the problem is that when people kind of unqualifyingly throw out, that's settled science. Well, what does that mean?
Right.
Who says?
Right. And here's, I think really when you hear that term, you're really getting into my world, the world of words, the world of communication, and quite frankly, the world of propaganda. Because that really,
rhetoric,
from a political standpoint, that is thrown out there basically as a way of ending debate.
Yeah, it's bludgeon.
Yeah. So, if I'm anti whatever, let's say lockdowns.
Yeah.
Somebody will say, "Oh no, that's settled science." Well, it's clearly not. But
that presupposes, though, like, what do we mean by settled science?
Right.
They're saying that by what they are saying is it is beyond the scope of debate.
Right. Exactly.
We don't have to debate this anymore. There is no this public policy that we're promoting does not have a possible rebut.
Right.
It has the ability to be presupposed now for further conversation.
Right. And I think that goes back to kind of what we were getting at before.
Yeah.
We talk about science trying to do too much.
Yeah.
We could let's just say that all of the things that we quote unquote know about the coronavirus now, which I suspect is less than a lot of people are willing to admit. But let's just assume that whatever they're basing these policies on, the science of that is true. It still doesn't necessarily tell you that policy X is the best policy to follow, because
Correct.
Then you're getting into more of economics in terms of human behavior and the idea that you have to balance risks and consequences and things like that. So the science may be correct, as far as it goes, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what you should do given that set of circumstances. And I would look at that the other way and say that, going back to what we were talking about with the Bible, trying to turn that into a science book is just as erroneous. Because you're trying to do too much. And now I'll pick on the libertarians. I think sometimes libertarian philosophy tries to do too much.
Oh yeah.
We want this philosophy to be the end all cure all of and answer every question of social interaction. And I don't think, as great as the non-aggression principle is and the idea of self-ownership, there are things that we have to wrestle with that I don't know that those things answer those questions.
Absolutely. Oh, there's so much to unpack in all you just said.
All right,
I want to
start unpacking.
All right, let's start from what you last said and work backwards.
All right.
Absolutely. In fact, at the LCI, we're very adamant about the fact that libertarianism is not a complete worldview. That's something that, in fact, we've been so adamant about it before even things happened, like, a debate with Al Mohler, which is now actually going on about 5 years ago.
Right.
Which is
Gosh,
crazy.
Has it been that long?
It's been that long. Yeah.
That's wild.
Funny story. I did that whole interview from my MIT office.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. In the chemical engineering building at MIT.
Nice.
Yeah. It was because I had a landline phone there.
Right.
And it still disconnected on me.
Of course.
It was wild. But anyway, the libertarians are, I don't really want to say notorious for trying to extend our theory too far, but I don't, because I don't really think that's true. But I think we do need to be careful in kind of expressing humility,
right?
For what we know and what we don't know. It's difficult sometimes to accept the fact that, you know what, I don't know how this is going to pan out.
Right.
But if I did, it'd actually be like actually, it's a feature and not a bug that we don't know how it would all turn out. Because if we did, then that would perhaps suppose that you should put me, the libertarian, in charge and run everything. And that would be sort of, wait a second, didn't I just say we shouldn't put one person in charge to run everything? So it gets a little confusing in that respect. So expressing that level of humility, I think, is important. And also we tend to try and apply things to every type of edge case in that's possible, and that's just probably not a good idea.
Right. Well, I mean, just looking at ethics, one of the things that I'm big on private property. I'm big on private property to the point that I believe that if a private business wants to keep my wife and I out because we are an interracial couple, they have every right, quote unquote, to do that. Yeah. But that right doesn't make it right. That is not the right way to treat somebody. So libertarian doesn't really tell you anything about necessarily, it does when you're talking about the use of force and aggression, but sometimes just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should.
Yeah. It's an incomplete theory, if you will.
Right.
But if it were utterly complete, then it would probably be baseless.
Right.
But that we'll use Gödel's incompleteness theorem to go after that one. Maybe. We won't get into that.
I don't know what that is, so let's not.
Oh, but a philosophical can of worms. Oh no,
that's what we do on the GodArchy podcast.
It's open cans of worms.
Yes, and then you just leave them there wiggling and go on.
Well, and so that I think that that's kind of an important point. Ultimately, is that we should, just as we would say, as I learned from my mentors, how to be humble in our aspirations of what our data says and what our theories might suppose. We should be humble in our pronouncements, even as libertarians, and understandably so.
Right.
And that would be a virtue. Humility is a virtue in this regard. So that's great. Okay, so backing up, this idea of scientists running public policy is it's kind of silly when you think about it. Like when you start actually kind of realizing what you're asking for at that point, you realize that it's not necessarily a good idea.
Yeah.
When you let epidemiologists suddenly decide they're going to make all the public policy pronouncements, that's a problem.
Yeah.
I will add, however, that in certain cases, at least those people who are epidemiologists, even in like the CDC and whatnot, have actually been supposed by many people to be saying more than they actually did. But that's a whole nother story.
Right. Oh, no, I totally believe that. Yeah. It's interesting. I'm a journaler. And so as part of my devotional time, I actually typically go back and read last year's journal entry on that date. So of course I've been going through now the early days of lockdown and whatnot. And it's interesting reflecting, reading back what I was thinking then in the context of what, looking back, there was a lot of things that I was writing is I don't know how bad this virus really is. Mm-hmm. But I do know that locking down society is bad economically, and maybe we should be looking at the consequences of this action and balancing those risks. And that's something that when you get people that are specialized, an epidemiologist, I mean, they're thinking purely in terms of epidemiology. They're not necessarily thinking in terms of what does it mean when you shut down the entire economy, you know? Again, trying to do too much, right?
Yeah. And a good way to think about this, and it's funny for me to kind of go this direction a little bit, but you know, not all scientists should be making the business decisions of a scientifically oriented business.
That makes sense.
Think about that for a sec. Mm-hmm. You know, if you suddenly decided that, because I've got scientific knowledge, I should be put in charge of my company because nanny nanny boo boo, I'm the scientist and the business guy isn't. You know what? That would be a mistake, because I might be as right as rain in my conclusions, but if I don't make the right business decision, then I totally hurt the company.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that seems relatively obvious, right?
I've got the perfect example of that. I worked for a guy when I was in TV news. The news director came from he started out as a cameraman and then got into the production and graphics side and was fantastic at that. If you go back and look at that TV station's Derby coverage, I mean, everything was amazing. The graphics, the camera work. And he carried that over as a news director, but he was an awful news director because he had no clue how to manage people. Mm. And the fact they promoted him based on his technical expertise and the successes that he had in those technical positions, and they put him in a position where he was way over his head because he was not a manager. And that's exactly where you could take that scientist who is dead on with the science, but if he doesn't know how to, or she doesn't know how to manage people and look at finances and all of those other things that go along with running a business, you can get underwater really fast.
Exactly. And I think that sort of illustrates why you can't just assume that because you have the most talented scientist in the world at the top of your, organization, that they suddenly will also have all the insights to make public policy decisions as well. And that was something that I think was underappreciated, by now at this point, both administrations. And that's, and granted, even as libertarians, we don't assume that even the public policymakers can really harmonize all of the interests of the society together in order to figure out how everything should go.
Yeah.
If anything, if in my estimation, things would have gone a lot better had there been a little more humility that had been presented by the varying, talk organizations or whatever, CDC, the White House, et cetera, in the early days. And it just made just been very clear that we're going to make some recommendations here based on what we have so far. Mm-hmm. And you need to understand that the more data we collect, that there's probably going to be some other recommendations that'll be made, and they may look different than what we have now. But here's what we got. Yeah. And it probably would have gone a lot better.
Well, if just in doing that, you give yourself an out.
Yeah.
And I think by being so dogmatic sometimes, and this is not just a lesson for pandemic policy. I think this is a lesson for theology and politics in general. When you put yourself in a dogmatic position, it's very difficult to back off of that, right? I mean, just because of human nature and pride, it's like, well, I don't want to admit that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And if you admit up front that you might be wrong, it's a lot easier to make a shift and say, you know what, I was right, I was wrong. Maybe we need to, I feel like in some senses, and of course, I don't have any idea what was in any of these people's minds or what's in their minds now, but it seems like that rigidness, I would be surprised if there wasn't some moments where they're like, well, that was not a good idea, but this is the path we're on now. So we're have you ever watched the Ken Burns documentary on the documentary? God, That's something. It's a joke. It's a family joke. Anyway, the documentary on the Vietnam War.
I have not seen that.
Yeah,
I haven't been on Ken Burns very often recently. So.
No, well, it was fantastic. My wife and I got sucked into it, and one of the things that was really interesting is you did see that where these politicians, even as early as Lyndon Johnson, were recognizing that they were in a situation that was untenable, and yet they were still marching out in front of the public saying, we can win this war, because they had staked their position on that, and there was no way they could back down to it and save face. That's an ugly lesson of politics and
it's
dogma.
one of those. Yeah, it's amazing. Like, politics attracts psychopathic types of individuals.
Right. Sociopath is what I always call it.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's more of the sociopath, but it attracts that sort of power mongering mentality at times, and they cannot let themselves get an egg in their face ever.
Well, then because you might not get reelected, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because how opposite that is from actually doing real science.
Well, like, I have my suspicions.
Well, I mean, think about it. Like, the crux of doing science is the admission that you could be wrong. Like, you're literally trying to find any way you can to prove yourself wrong.
Right.
That's the point.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's why it's so exciting when you actually feel like you have something really important to say, like that now you've hit something on a level of certainty that is so much better than what you had, and yet you still have to be out there saying, like, I'm putting this out there in order for anybody else to prove it wrong, right, and throw me down. That's the nature of what we're doing, right. And that it's amazing when you to kind of see a lot of the kind of public facing scientists that are the pop scientists now who just seem to have no end to their level of certainty pronouncements. Yeah, it's like what the Neil deGrasse Tyson tweet that got shot down by Steakums.
Right,
in the last
Steakums
weekend,
is on a roll, man.
Yeah, well, we're NGT was basically saying that. The great thing about science is that it's true even if you don't believe it, and it's like there's so much wrong with that. I feel like I'm like the Luke Skywalker quote from The Last Jedi is like, every single word that just came out of your mouth was wrong. Amazing, right?
How'd you do that?
How'd you do that? Yeah.
So here's a question for you. It's kind of a loaded question.
Oh boy,
how? We've got the science. How do you make policy on something that admittedly could be proved wrong?
Ooh, well, that perhaps the first admissible thing in such an argument would be perhaps if your ability and power to is perhaps a bit bigger than it should be if you're going to be making these sorts of pronouncements to begin with.
That's exactly the answer that I was kind of trolling for there.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also there's other things you could kind of consider that perhaps the opportunity then is to not leverage the influence that you have toward ordering people around, but rather toward providing an atmosphere or environment where the information is just available.
Yeah.
That's like, for instance, I hate to kind of put it this way, but probably my favorite government organization, if you will, whatever, is Nist, the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Okay.
Because
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, well, it's a kind of neat place. They have, they do a lot of neat stuff.
Yeah.
But their mission is really to be a kind of it's sometimes called the industry's national lab.
Okay.
And the idea being that they're there not to try and weaponize policy by any means, but rather to be a vehicle for development of standardized technology, period. Mm-hmm. In other words, things like they were a huge mover and shaker in the last couple of years in fine tuning definitions of the universal constants.
Okay.
For instance, and that's like that. Yes, these are things that are, don't get me wrong. Any of this stuff could be conceivably done on the free market. I get it.
Right.
I'm totally on board with that.
Right.
But if this, in terms of like second bestism, in a way, like this is probably one that I'd rather see, than any number of other types of things that the government might do.
Right. Like blow up people overseas.
Yeah, like blow up people overseas or put, people in cages for prohibition and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of ways that I could, a lot of things I would eliminate first. But, these sorts of things can work if you're going to have any type of policy at all, bringing these sorts of standardized methods into bear and whatnot, consulting with industry in order to help make it happen,
right.
Coming up with kind of consortium models. Like these things are at least conceivable,
right?
And they're better than just here's a top down, we're going to, shove it down everybody's throats.
Now, you're talking about making suggestions, putting the information out there. And I think that's been a big struggle, particularly looking at the pandemic, where all of your information is coming from government sources. And it seems like, well, it doesn't seem like there's obviously some information is being censored.
Yeah. It's been tricky. One of the interesting things, not to just, rebut you right off the bat.
Well, no, feel free.
One thing that's interesting has been the release of a lot of information into the public square. And for instance, a lot of journals, which are often behind paywalls and whatnot,
right.
peer-reviewed journals and whatnot, often behind paywalls. Anything related to infectious disease has pretty much just been opened up. Especially if it's related to coronavirus, anything related to coronaviruses in general, almost all of it's just got instantly opened up. And the NIH, a lot of their journals and what's registered there, especially if funded publicly, from grant monies or whatnot, already is in open access, and they opened up even more stuff.
Right.
And so there has been a lot of, almost information overload on some level. And that's, I think, perhaps underappreciated to an extent by the world at large, is just how much information and knowledge was generated by academia, by industry, and was put out there in peer-reviewed journals, in white papers, in working papers, just amazing amounts of data and studies that were put forward, and like to the extent it's almost like watching science happen in fast forward mode.
Right.
So what I don't fully appreciate, when people say like, "Oh, this certain data is being censored," I'm not sure what that is at times.
Right.
Because, for instance, a really interesting example of this was the hydroxychloroquine debate. Okay. And people were saying things like, "Oh, well, the information is being pushed out. It's not out there." But every time somebody said that, it was like within 24 hours, you could find yet another study that was either in process or getting peer reviewed or that was already getting published.
Right.
That was providing more information, better knowledge, better data on the hypothesis of, does hydroxychloroquine actually work?
Right.
And it ultimately turned out that it didn't. That's okay. We figured it out so much faster
than
it otherwise, because there was so much interest right off the bat. Yes, it took some time to get the appropriate studies done and to where we could do things like double-blind trials and whatnot. But the plural of anecdote is not data. When somebody just comes out of their clinic and says, "Well, I prescribed hydroxychloroquine to 5 people and they went and they were fine."
Right.
I'm sorry, that's not good enough. That's not a good standard for making a clinical assessment, and so on. I think that, so again, when we say there was data being censored or information being censored, like, I don't fully know what we're looking for in that respect. Like, what were we expecting to see?
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, just maybe I'm thinking more broadly. Maybe the problem isn't so much in the science community as it is in the information community, in the world of journalism and that type of thing. But when you see, Tom Woods doing a talk about the ineffectiveness of lockdowns and it being taken off of YouTube, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, where you have legitimate policy debates and we've decided, no, this is the correct policy and we're not going to let anybody talk about anything that is contrary to the path that we have chosen. And you see this a little bit with the vaccines. You can't. I think it is fair to be skeptical of a newly produced vaccine.
Sure.
I don't think that's unreasonable. We're not allowed to have that discussion. We go get the damn vaccine. Basically, is what.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's like I don't think there's any problem with anybody saying like. Let me rephrase that. I don't think there's been a huge backlash against the idea that like, okay, well, I don't want to be the first monkey shot into space,
right?
But now like, so what do? I think people should be allowed to, to assess their own risk and whether or not they want to be amongst those first monkeys shot into space.
Right.
That's fine. I mean, if you want to do that, that's fine.
Right.
And now, like I think we've got a whole lot of monkeys shot into space.
Right.
And so now it feels a lot better if you want to be a monkey shot into space.
Right.
So
I mean, I still don't want to be a monkey shot into space, but for me, it's
there'll be a whole lot of monkeys up there.
For me, it is a risk analysis.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that being exceptionally healthy for a 50 whatever old I am, the risk of me having a severe problem with the coronavirus, if I get it, and I think, quite frankly, I think I've already had it, but that's a whole different story. But if I were to get it, I think the likelihood of me having a bad outcome is pretty low.
Yeah,
I think the likelihood of me having an issue getting vaccinated is pretty low, but I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. So for me, the risk is I just don't feel inclined to do it.
So you don't feel like there's a big consequence to waiting.
Right.
Long.
Now, if I was 75 years old and had, diabetes or something like that, I would probably think differently. Like my mom, who's battling cancer, I would certainly not say, "Oh, you shouldn't go get vaccinated." That would be kind of nutty.
It would be a problem.
And maybe that gets to, the whole idea that that humanity wants, we want the one size fits all solution, and that's not a thing.
Correct. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So that all the types of questions that you're asking are those of trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And trade-offs are economic decisions and not purely based on scientific data,
right?
Per se. We humans are characteristically bad, by the way, at really assessing risk.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And which is, I mean, you can kind of understand this, even just based on our own kind of ancient history, is that if you're a hunter gatherer and you hear, a funny sound in the woods, 999 times out of 1,000, it's probably nothing.
Right.
But the one time it's a tiger,
right? You're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
Yeah.
So what do? Every time you run.
Right.
So we're kind of accustomed to, instinctively read our scenarios as looking to avert losses.
Right.
We feel loss aversion more strongly than gains, if you will.
Yeah.
And so as a result, this has a strange effect on our calculus internally of risk.
Sure.
And so, if you understand risk as, okay, it is a combination of the effects or the intensity or the consequence of whatever is the potential problem,
mm-hmm.
The severity, that's the word I'm looking for. It's a product of the severity of the consequence and the probability that thing might occur.
Right.
And so we know this when we can, we can analyze this, and if we think it through critically, we realize that this is how I'm supposed to think about this. But often we're very much attuned to just the loss side rather than the probability side.
Right.
And so when you were describing your own situations, like, okay, I feel like I'm, relatively low risk as an individual. And so, but in terms of both receiving a vaccine and having a negative reaction, and also of overall being a problem if I developed COVID.
Right.
So you don't feel like, all right. So then you say, well, okay, my risk is relatively low in both cases. So now I just need to decide, all right, well, what can I mitigate, and then what am I comfortable with?
Right.
So if you feel comfortable in your particular lifestyle right now, you're like, okay, I'm doing good the way I am in my social interactions in my life right now. I don't need to push for getting a vaccine as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
That's a calculus decision that you make, and you're right to do that.
Right. And it may not be good. I mean, you have to confess when you talk about, you can't take emotion out of that equation either.
Sure.
You look at the person who is petrified, will not get on an airplane, and yet drives around in a car all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not rational, but that's how they feel.
No, it's rational, but it's not. Let's be clear. Like let's use the Misesian definition of rational here.
Okay.
Right. Okay. It's rational because they're making they're taking action based on what they perceive to be in their own best interest.
Right.
But it's not logical because it doesn't accurately assess the probabilities and severities involved in the activities that they're undergoing.
So I'll make a confession when it comes to the vaccine. There's honestly a little part of me that's like, I'm not doing this because they want me to so badly. That's part of my personality. It's like, don't touch this. Okay, well, I'm going to touch it because you told me not to.
Yeah,
I blame my stepdad for that.
But isn't it interesting that there's a lot of people out there that don't get this when it comes to even doing public policy in general. I love I'll use another Star Wars quote here because I'm a Star Wars nerd, and so I use a lot of Star Wars analogies.
I support this.
Yeah. Leia tells Tarkin in episode 4, like the more you tighten your grip, the more star systems go through your fingers.
Yes.
And that's exactly what happens in these sorts of scenarios for people. I don't think people seem to realize that there are folks out there who, if you start trying to order them around, they're going to put up resistances. Whereas if you go to them and treat them like equals rather than inferiors, then you're going to have much better effects. If Donald Trump himself goes up to my conservative father-in-law and orders him to wear a mask, he's probably going to say no.
Yeah.
Right. That's what's going to happen.
Right.
But if I come up to him and say, hey, father-in-law, I think that based on the best knowledge that I've got to this, I think you're going to be better off in what we're going to do when we're going to go out to the grocery store or whatever. I think you'd be best off, wearing a mask there. And you know what? He'll listen to me.
Yeah.
Because there's relational authority there. It's also not trying to order him around.
Right.
It's trying to treat him like a person rather than a peon.
Yeah. All right, so we've been going for almost an hour now. So,
oh my goodness,
I know, right?
Feels like we just started.
I want to circle back to another meta and just get your thoughts on it, because I think a lot of this hinges on what I'm about to say.
Oh,
I think when you look at this, the pop devotion to science, or the evangelical rejection of science because Genesis 1 says so-and-so, and the libertarian impulse to try to solve every single problem of human interaction with the libertarian not that I almost said theology. Maybe it is a theology in some sense to some folks. The philosophy. I think a lot of this is rooted in something that is innate in human beings, is we want to control basically everything.
Yep.
So we're looking for an ism or a philosophy or a doctrine or a dogma that we can have that will explain everything, and then we can just go on with our lives because we have everything solved. And I think this filters into Christianity in a sense where we want to have the checklist. You know, we do X, Y, and Z, and God has to accept us because we did X, Y, and Z, daggone it. So in a sense, we're trying to control God. And maybe this all goes back to this whole sinful notion that we can be like God. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a lot to unpack there. It is remarkable that even scientists do not understand oftentimes the nature of their own philosophy. I always thought it was funny for instance, that, during my PhD studies, a PhD is a doctorate in philosophy. Right. Okay. Yet I never took a philosophy class. I never was instructed by my mentors in, hey, there's this, there's such a thing as the philosophy of science, and you might want to know something about that. Yeah. And maybe, read some Karl Popper or some Thomas Kuhn or Michael Polanyi or these other folks who are seminal thinkers in the field.
I actually knew who Karl Popper is.
Oh, well, very good, man. There you go. Yeah.
I took some science classes in college. I actually started out pre-med, so I went all the way to organic chemistry, which I almost failed, and thus left pre-med.
Funny story. When I went to Rolla as my undergrad, I had done a number of hours in community college as a to kind of get a head start. Right. So I started as essentially like a sophomore in a university student. Right. And my first chemistry class was actually organic chemistry. And so imagine, if you will, a whole bunch of sophomores getting utterly crushed by the freshmen who came in organic chemistry. That was fun. It was funny. Yeah. But it was also a great experience because my first teacher there invited me to do research with her over the course of the next year. Oh, very cool. And it was an incredibly formative experience for me, in very much convincing me that I wanted to continue doing research. Yeah. Anyway, but nonetheless, but I guess going back to it though, is that, scientists often don't understand their own philosophy. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think sometimes scientists will miss out on one of the most formative things that needs to happen as a scientist, as a practicing scientist. And that is to learn how to be humble and honest in all of what you're doing. Because as we were discussing earlier, I have to posit from the outset of what I am doing as a scientist that I could be wrong. And I am trying very hard to prove that to be so. Mm-hmm. If I can demonstrably show that I am wrong, then I have to. Then that allows me then to. It actually is a freeing experience on some level.
You've done it right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You've. If you can disprove something, that that's no longer the case. Right. And there's a lot of discussions that happen even at the academic level about the problem of not being able to often report negative results. Mm-hmm. We're very much always pressured to show positive results for things, but that actually so there's this kind of push and pull of what people want to see versus what our philosophy says we need to be. Right. And that is perhaps a kind of an interesting object lesson for a lot of life on some level. Yeah. I think. Well, that's exactly what I was thinking as you were saying that. I mean, we should probably approach pretty much everything with that kind of mindset. And especially, I mean, even as it pertains to the way in which we interact theologically with people, is that there's, it's why we have differences or we differentiate what is dogma versus what is doctrine versus what is opinion. Right. And why we should be, we should hold fast to dogma, and it's what we're united around, whether we're Church of Christ like me, or Lutheran, or Presbyterian, or whatever.
Right.
Versus the types of doctrines that we hold, which do have maybe some say very significant differences in the way that we think about things, but we're not unified around that in the same way.
Right.
Versus opinions, where that could be a whole lot of different.
we got all kinds of that out there.
Yeah. Or preferences even.
Right.
I'm a Church of Christ kid. I like my a cappella music and things. That's definitely not what modern evangelism. Evangelicalism.
Does your hymn book have the little like shape notes?
Shape notes?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Certain ones do, certain ones don't. I don't actually read shape notes. I just read music.
Yeah.
I was taught by my mama.
The only reason I know anything about shape notes is one of my best friends growing up. His mom was Primitive Baptist.
Oh yeah.
And
they're
so,
an acapella tradition too.
Yeah, and she had a shape notes hymnal in the house, and I picked it up one day. I was like, "What is this?"
My dad can read shape notes.
Yeah.
It's always been impressive, but I learned solfege, so I'm like a Sound of Music kid, I guess.
Yeah.
So
I do everything by ear, so I don't read anything.
Oh well. I had a whole lot of musical training as a young churchman, I guess you might say.
Now I can read music, but I generally I can't sight read very well, so for me it's very much a right-brained auditory listen, mock what I hear. So
all right. But anyway, like these things are really important, I think, to remember about who we are, as social beings.
Right.
That there's so many things that we should be circumspect about, about ourselves and about what we believe, about what we think, and just being, willing to be humble is something that we can never stop learning.
Yep, and it's hard.
Yeah,
humility is
sure.
hard, especially for
science does get you. I think that if you're willing to take your lumps and go through the process, it is a great way of learning how to be humble.
Yeah.
Because it kind of requires you to be so.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there are those, the awful scientists out there who really do think they know everything and are God's gift to man.
Right.
And science. I'm looking at you, NGT. But those are much fewer and far between from the really good people out there who are doing good work and are finding ways of improving people's lives that a lot of us will never understand. I mean, it's like iPencil on steroids.
Yeah.
Because there's so much out there to learn and to build upon. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Just what I've had the opportunity to learn in my own professional career, there's so much to do, and there's so many cool things out there to learn, and there's so many opportunities to serve your fellow man and to do interesting things.
Well, I'm glad there's scientists like you out there.
Oh, thanks.
Doing those things. And like you said, I'm sure that there's a lot of them. It's like the same thing. Journalism gets a bad rap, but there are a lot of really good reporters and journalists out there that are trying, to do good reporting and good, tell good stories and shed light on the truth. And sometimes the institutions that are stacked on top of them make it very difficult to see the good work that's out there. And I'm sure that's probably true in the world of science too, because what gets projected as science in the kind of mainstream eyes, probably very little of what actually is going on in the scenes. Like you said, you've got all these people that are doing these research and writing these journal articles and doing all of this trench work that, you don't hear about those dudes.
Yep.
You hear about Fauci and the politicos and whatnot. So.
Yeah.
So what's going on over at LCI that people need to know about?
Oh man. Well, the big thing for us this year is really promoting our book, Faith Seeking Freedom. That is our book, inspired in many respects by our wonderful forebears, such as Mary Ruwart and her short answers to tough questions. This book is, our own kind of take on kind of this sort of thing. And so the Faith Seeking Freedom is Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And it's just about, about 140 pages long and goes through over 100 questions that we feel are really, the types of things that Christians often have asked us, or that we think that, lead on from things that they do feel are important and will want to ask and will want to know about. So that's really our big thing for the year. Besides that, we're really just trying to grow and expand, inviting people to participate, either as authors, as writers who want to spread the word, as people who want to support the work in other ways, whether that's through your donation or your time or your other types of efforts. We're wanting to build on that and just kind of really want to accomplish this mission of equipping the church to promote a free society. Yeah. And to do that, we don't know all the things that we're going to need to do in order to get there. Right. But we're going to keep listening to our people and being responsive to the needs that we see as best we can. And we see ourselves as really being right now in the kind of content generation phase, where we're trying to build an edifice of thought and provide people with continuous value all the time, that they can see us and trust us that we are going to do the best we can to provide them with a solid knowledge base to go to when they want to inquire and learn about what it means to be a Christian in today's world, where in a world that is characterized by aggression and where we want to live otherwise. Yeah,
I will give you a plug.
Cool.
Back in the day, like I don't know how long ago it was, but when I was first starting to try to put together my faith and my libertarian thought in a coherent way. So I kind of, I was a Christian, and then I came into libertarian philosophy, and then there came a point was like, okay, I really need to integrate my worldview so that I'm not, have everything in silos. And Libertarian Christian Institute was the first thing that I ran across that had content that started helping me make sense of a lot of these things. And that was in the early days. I mean, it was it was like a pretty rough website at the time, but the content
LCI then.
Yeah, the content though is what I remember. I think actually you wrote a couple of articles on Romans 13. Those resources are fantastic, and it's only grown since then. So I would encourage everybody who's listening who wants to avail yourself of the vast resources that are over at LCI. And of course, I will link to that stuff on the show notes page as well.
Well, thanks, Mike. You're very kind, and we very much value what you've done as well. And we're so thankful for all the work that you've done in bringing your GodArchy into being and being active in our community and elsewhere, and doing so much for the movement and for the sake of the cross. So, we just love you and appreciate you.
Well, back at you. So with the Mutual Admiration Society, we will we'll close it out. But I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk about this and being willing to kind of be my guinea pig. Because, like I said, I had a vague idea of where I wanted to go, and I think we hit the highlights and probably went much farther than I even imagined. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to be on the show and talk about this, because I think it's important. It's an important subject for us as Christians and libertarians and human beings living in this world to kind of try to make sense of the world of science and the role that it plays in our thinking and policy even.
Awesome. Yeah, and if there's anything I can leave everybody with, it's that it's time to be, very self-critical, very self-reflective in all of these things. Let's keep learning. Let's keep striving forward and just being the best we can be in this regard. Whether that's, whether you're trying to learn theology or trying to learn science, let's get it all worked out together.
Love it. All right. Thanks again, man.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
She blinded me with science. I can't get that song out of my head. Fantastic conversation with Norman. I really appreciate him coming on the show again. Do check out what's going on over at the Libertarian Christian Institute. They're doing fantastic work, as I mentioned on the show. They were a big part in providing resources for me as I was trying to put together my own, kind of coherent worldview with my political outlook, my political beliefs, and my faith. So a lot of fantastic resources over at LCI. I think with that, we're just going to close out the show. It's a pretty long interview, and I ain't got nothing else to say. So, shut up when you're ahead, right? I do want to quickly say, though, if you enjoy what we're doing here at GodArchy, I covet your support. You can do that through Patreon, patreon.com/GodArchy. You'll see our supporting listeners program over there. I've mentioned this before. One of the things that we do that I think is unique is 40% of my Patreon receipts actually go back out to other organizations. This last month, I gave a donation to an organization down in the southern border area, folks that are helping out with the migrant situation. So every month we try to figure out some place that we can send a little bit of money to help out, to put this idea of voluntaryism into action. So check that out, patreon.com/GodArchy. If you don't want to donate through Patreon, there is a link at godarchy.org where you can just donate through PayPal, and I appreciate that as well. But your support, again, is coveted and much appreciated. So with that, let's wrap up the show. Make sure you visit godarchy.org. Check out what's going on over at the website. Back episodes of the podcast, lots of articles. And of course, social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, all those places. Links to that stuff are on the show notes page. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.
Till he come, well, ain't he gonna lay my armor down? Ain't he gonna lay my armor down? Ain't he gonna lay my
Oh, you ready for excuse me. You have been listening to the GodArchy podcast in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit with Mike Maharry. GodArchy is an oh my goodness production. You can find us on the World Wide Web at godarchy.org, on the Facebook at GodArchy.org, and on the Twitter at GodArchy. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@godarchy.org, but no stupid questions, please. And you can support the show at patreon.com. Get in that pocketbook and get some money out. This ain't cheap to do. Thank you for listening. Thank you. And God bless you all in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Billy